About a year ago, I bought this used 2021 fully electric Kia Niro, but why this car? Well, it was basically process of elimination. I definitely wanted an electric car for a number of reasons, so that requirement alone, plus my fairly small budget of about $40,000 at the absolute maximum, meant I was really only considering a few different cars to begin with. Fast forward a year, there's now quite a few more options in that price range, but back then it was fairly limited. I was probably going to buy a used car for cost reasons, so I spent a lot of time looking at carsales.com.au. I set the fuel type to electric and then sorted by price, lowest first, and I was met with several pages of old Nissan Leafs, however you say the plural of Nissan Leaf. Even then, you could buy a 2012 to 2014-ish Nissan Leaf for about $10,000 to $15,000, but they are a bit small and a bit old, and the super low range on them really restricts them to city driving only, so I quickly moved on from that. But for I think about $20,000 to $25,000, you could get a Gen 2 Nissan Leaf that had been completely updated, so it had a nicer interior, better screen with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto, and a range of comfortably about 200 kilometers, which still isn't great, but would make longer drives possible. But after doing quite a bit of research, I ended up abandoning that idea as well, because even the Gen 2 Leaf still uses the outdated CHAdeMO port for fast charging, which could make it a bit more difficult to charge on road trips, especially going forward into the future when some stations just aren't even installing the CHAdeMO plug at all now. And apparently the battery doesn't have proper active cooling, so in warmer climates, if you fast charge more than one time in a day, the charging speed really starts to slow down. So I still think the Gen 2 Leaf is quite a good car for local driving, but I wanted to do quite a lot of road trips, so it just wasn't really going to be a very good option for me. I'd be charging quite often, and I'd have to find chargers with CHAdeMO plugs, and then it would charge slowly, and because I'm charging so many times, it would get really slow, so it just wasn't going to be that good of an option. The next car I came across was the MG ZS EV, which is basically MG's cheap and cheerful SUV, but with the engine, transmission and fuel tank removed and swapped out for a battery and electric motor. When I first started looking at these, they were about $38,000 used, but by the time I bought my car, you could really pick one up for around 25 grand or so, as long as you don't mind it having quite a lot of kilometers on the odometer already. And I did seriously consider this car. While the interior was probably manufactured quite cheaply, it looked nice and modern and had pretty much everything I wanted. The range was still only about the same as a Gen 2 Nissan Leaf, but at least it had a CCS2 charging port, which is now very much the standard in Australia, and it was hopefully going to charge somewhat decently. But in the end, I kind of had two concerns. One was that the range certainly wasn't great, and the cheaper ones already had 100,000 kilometers on them, so with possible degradation, it could even be getting even worse soon. And the other concern was, at the time, MG sold the petrol ZS for around $20,000 drive away, which makes it a really cheap car. And I'm assuming they would have reused just about every part they could from the petrol car in the EV. So I was just worried I'd end up with a very cheap feeling car. So I was just a little concerned about buying one of those. But around the same time, MG had also recently released their MG4. And that had been getting pretty good reviews online. And at the time, the base model was just within my budget, so I could have actually bought a brand new EV. And I seriously considered that for quite a while. There was also the GWM Aura, which is basically the same story, but I preferred the look of the MG4 a bit more, so if I was going to go with one of those, it would have been the MG4. But while I really liked the higher trim levels, the base model one, the only one that I could afford at the time, didn't have that great a range. It was better than the MG ZS, but still not quite as good as I probably wanted it to be. And this sounds fussy, but the base model had cloth seats, and I was worried they might start getting gross over time with food and sweat and everything soaking in, rather than these leather seats that just wipe off so easily. I cleaned the car yesterday, I gave them quite a wipe down with water, and they're a lot cleaner now. So I just sort of kept that in mind, and I kept thinking about it, and I kept scrolling through car sales whenever I had spare time. And eventually, I came across several listings for used Kia Niros. And I hadn't really considered the Niro up until this point, but I then watched a few reviews on YouTube and looked through all the details online, and the more I looked, the more it just seemed to tick all of my boxes. It was within my budget, only just, but I could make it work. It's a good size, fairly nice interior, most of the modern features I wanted, like the adaptive cruise control and a big screen with Apple CarPlay and Android Auto and everything, and 450 kilometers of range, which isn't exactly outstanding, but it's quite a bit better than all the other cars I'd been looking at. And honestly, if I'm on a road trip and I run it from fairly full to fairly empty, I'm very much ready to stop for a break, so I think the range is really as much as I would need. The DC charging speed isn't great, at only 75 kilowatts, and I would like it to be a bit faster, but it's still faster than most of the other cars I was looking at in this price range, so it's really not too big of an issue, and it really charges in okay of a time. Around the time I bought this car, I did also see a Tesla Model 3 for only slightly more money than I paid for this, but it was a few years older with 100,000 kilometers on it, and it was a private sale, not through a dealer, and at the time I was actually still a P-plater, which meant I couldn't have legally driven that car in some states until I got off my Ps. So in the end, I went with this 2021 Kia Niro with 38,000 kilometers on it, so a lot newer than the Tesla that I possibly could have gone with. And it was being sold by Western Mitsubishi, a Mitsubishi dealership in the western suburbs. I have no idea how this car ended up at Western Mitsubishi, but anyway, I paid pretty much spot on $40,000 for it drive away, which at the time I think was a pretty good deal. And as I said at the start of this video, I've now had the car for just over a year, and I've mostly been very happy with it. But I do have a separate video about my experience with the car, so if you're interested in that, you can go and watch that video. But apart from that, maybe I'll see you in another video in the future.